We have a major problem. Many dispensationalists, not all, simply cannot defend the consistency, coherency, and cohesiveness of Scripture. Almost daily, I get emails, private messages, and more about how I don't understand the gospel because I don't accept that Jesus preached a works gospel and Paul preached the true gospel of grace. I readily get told that Hebrews and James are for tribulation Jews and not for the Christian church. I'm told that the Gospels do not contain a gospel that saves today. Jews have one way of being saved, Gentiles another. There's one gospel for this time period and another gospel for another dispensation, and yet another gospel for a time yet to come. It is frustrating on so many levels. Some time back, I did a video titled, "What Good is a Perfect Bible If You Have Horrible Theology?" And these guys will fight to the death in defense of the King James Version and tell everyone they know that they must rightly divide the word of truth, only to butcher the gospel. There is a pox on the Christian church today. There is a cancer within fundamentalism, and I wish I could say that it could be limited to Mid-Acts Dispensationalism, but it cannot. Many dispensationalists proclaim Mid-Acts Dispensationalism and then deny that they do so, but they still divide the gospel. There are several popular IFB Internet preachers espousing this heresy of multiple gospels. They'll tell you that people were saved by works at one time in the past. Then there was a time when people were saved by faith plus works. Now one can only be saved by Paul's gospel, not Jesus's gospel. And during the Great Tribulation, works will be once again required for people to be saved. You don't believe me? Take a look. Robert Breaker has 688,000 rabid followers who will defend him to no end. He is clearly saying that Jesus preached a different gospel than Paul.
So why would you only go here when over here is the way to be saved? So the book of Acts is a transitional book from Jews to the church. From Israel to the church. Okay? From water baptism to blood, spirit baptism. And there's changes taking place. And that's why it's so important. And that's why you're instructed in the Bible to rightly divide. Now, go to Matthew chapter 4. When Jesus came, did Jesus Christ preach the same gospel as Paul? Well, some people who don't rightly divide and don't know their Bible would probably stand up and go, yes, Jesus and Paul preached the same gospel. Really?
You can find hours and hours of his online teaching where he explains how Jesus' gospel was for Old Testament Jews and Paul's gospel was for the church. He tells his audience that if you wish to be saved, you don't go to the gospels. You go to Paul's gospel. Let me give you another. Gene Kim of Real Bible Believers has 428,000 subscribers on YouTube and is followed loyally by many King James Version onlyists. He doesn't believe that Hebrews or James are for the church today. Don't waste your time in those books. Those are for Jews who go through the tribulation. That's why, according to him, those books do teach a faith plus works salvation. But don't take my word for it. Listen to him talking about the book of Hebrews.
The apostle is writing to those Jews that they have to labor, they have to work hard, combined with their faith for salvation because of the tribulation time. So the tribulation time, please remember this, don't confuse this, so I hope you're paying attention. Faith and works for salvation is tribulation only, okay? For Jews in tribulation. That is not you and me, okay? I hope everyone gets that. I don't want somebody to tell me after Bible study, thank you for telling me that we can lose our salvation. I have to do works to keep my faith. No, I never said that. I said that was for Jews in tribulation.
They have to work hard combined with their faith. Now, before you sit back and say, well, that might be true, but I'm not going through the tribulation, so it doesn't matter. It does matter. You can start in Genesis and go through to Revelation. There is no point in human history where God has ever accepted the works of righteousness or obedience to the law for salvation. Romans 3:10-24 clearly tells us that. If it was true when Paul said it, it was true when it was originally written. Just about every word that Paul writes in Romans 3:10-24 comes straight out of the Psalms and Isaiah. And most dispensationalists do not know that. Was the psalmist lying? Was he writing for a time that didn't apply to him and the people of his day? No. It was true when Paul quoted it, and it was true when the psalmist and Isaiah wrote it. Whatever your views of eschatology, salvation has always been and will always be by grace alone through faith alone. But it gets worse. Here's Gene Kim discussing why you don't need to worry about the book of James because it's describing a work salvation for Jews during the tribulation, just like he says of Hebrews.
James chapter 2 verse 24 seems to show that you have to have works for your faith in order to be saved. There are people who claim to believe in faith alone, but they say that this faith must have works in it. However, that automatically contradicts James 2:24, which says how that by works a man is justified and not by faith only. So then this passage is talking about faith and works, not faith alone that really works. That's contradictory. James 2:24 is not for the Christian church. That's the solution. It's for tribulation Jews. James chapter 1 verse 1 shows that the address is to the 12 tribes of Israel.
Where did they get this from? I wish I could tell you that they've been radicalized by an extreme right wing of hyper-dispensationalists. I've even called these guys hyper-dispensationalists in the past. But I have come to the point where I simply think that we can and should drop the hyper. They're simply dispensationalists. Why do I say that? Where do they get such a crazy doctrine? Well, they get it from the same place most IFB King James only pastors preach every single service. From the same place many IFB church members get their doctrine. They get it from right here. From the old Scofield Reference Bible. Yep, that's right. You heard me. I know what you're thinking. I'm a liar, right? Well, turn to page 1343 in your Scofield Reference Bible. That's the preferred Bible of the distinguished professor of homiletics, Dr. Tony Hudson. Right here it is. And on page 1343, on page 1342 and 1343, right under Revelation 4, 14:2 through 14:7, you will find Scofield's listing of what he identifies as 4 different gospels. Not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 4 distinct gospel presentations throughout history. He says the gospel of the kingdom, the gospel of the grace of God, the everlasting gospel, and then there's Paul's my gospel. And throughout the Scofield Study Bible, you will find that you'll find notes and commentary distinguishing what Jesus preached versus what Peter preached versus what Paul preached and versus what James and the author of Hebrews preached. We have a major problem. Not only is false teaching rampant within dispensationalism today, but many IFB King James Version only pastors tell their people to use the old Scofield Reference Bible with the Scofield Study System. What happens when you use the Scofield Study System? It leads you to this unbiblical false doctrine of multiple gospels. Scofield is known for emphasizing the phrase, rightly dividing the word of truth. That's why you hear it proclaimed by so many dispensationalists. You heard Breaker emphasize it earlier in the clip that I showed. What they both mean by that statement is to put the right gospel in the right time period or dispensation. It is frightening what people are being taught. And people in the pew will defend it to their dying breath because that's what their men of God told them to believe. As Pastor Gammons told a camp meeting crowd that I was at, every creature needs a preacher, and you are to obey your man of God. But sadly, the problem is even worse than I've described so far. Yesterday, this clip of Brandan Robertson, a homosexual and LGBTQ plus affirming pastor, made its way around the interwebs, as George W. Bush used to call it. I saw it first on the tweeter, as Governor Rick Perry once called it. Listen to this excerpt from Brandan Robertson's Q&A, and then let me bring it all together and tell you why this is relevant.
This one was submitted online. What do we know about Jesus and the actual teachings of Christ? And how do we divorce this from the usually hypocritical, Paul-centric teachings of a typical church? Well, this is one of my favorite questions. Because if you grew up in conservative evangelicalism, you probably grew up in Pauline Christianity, where Paul is more quoted and more followed than Jesus. And this is something I've been studying a lot recently, actually, because it is perplexing to me how even in all of my theology degrees, it was all centered on Paul and figuring out how to teach the church about Paul's theology to the detriment of what Jesus said. And I actually don't know if you know this, but if you read the New Testament, you find that Paul and Jesus often come into contradiction with each other. And a couple things about Paul that should be said. Paul never met Jesus, never heard Jesus preach. Paul only knows Jesus through secondhand knowledge. So as we're reading the writings of the Apostle Paul, we need to know who he is. We need to know his context. He's removed from Jesus himself. And Paul and Jesus are preaching two different gospels. Both are important to Christianity, but one is the gospel that we live by, and one is the Apostle Paul's unique mission. Paul's mission was to tell the story of Jesus around the world.
Robertson asks what we know about the teaching of Jesus and how we divorce this from what we know about the Pauline teaching of a typical church. Put simply, most dispensationalists cannot answer people like Robertson. How do you tell him that he's wrong for dividing Jesus from Paul when you yourself agree that Paul and Jesus preached different gospels and had different goals? How do you refute people like Robertson who separate and segregate portions and entire books of Scripture from one another so as to make them disjointed and presenting different and even conflicting messages? You cannot. If you hold to the views of Breaker, Kim, Roy Bell, and even C.I. Scofield. And the sad part is that most will not even try. People like these men cannot defend the Scriptures against people like Robertson. They're using the same argument. These men cannot offer a meaningful apologetic because their own biblical understanding is incoherent, inconsistent, and it presents a collection of 66 disparate books rather than one complete message that is fitly joined together. For the 12 years I pastored, I told everyone to never believe anything I tell them. Always look it up and verify it for yourselves. Be Bereans. That's what they did. The Apostle Paul, they did that to the Apostle Paul. They confirmed everything that he told them. Do not blindly trust your preacher. Do not blindly trust your reference Bible. If your theology isn't consistent, it isn't biblical theology.